The first time German sentries heard it, they didn't understand what was happening. It was the middle of the night, the steppe air cold enough to sting the lungs, and above the black line of the horizon came a sound that didn't belong to a modern war, the soft, ragged whisper of wind through canvas, and struts an old biplane cutting its engine and gliding like a shadow. Then the bombs fell, the earth jumped, and somewhere in the darkness a soldier muttered a new word, with a mixture of fear and contempt: Nachthexen, night witches. That nickname would travel far, far beyond the front lines that coined it, until it became a legend. But it began in a moment when the Soviet Union was fighting for its life, when every assumption about who could fight and how was being stripped down to raw necessity. And in that moment the idea of women flying combat missions, women in fighter planes and dive bombers, women navigating by starlight in open cockpits, was not a symbolic gesture. It was a decision born from disaster, ambition, and a certain kind of Soviet ruthlessness. If the state needed pilots, it would take them from wherever it could, even from the ranks of young women who had been told their whole lives that the sky was a place to admire, not a place to die. To understand why this happened, you have to feel the panic of 1941 in the Soviet Union. On 22 June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion that smashed into the USSR with a violence and speed that made previous wars feel like rehearsals. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded, airfields were destroyed on the ground, the Luftwaffe hunted aircraft as they tried to take off, and Soviet cities began to learn the sound of incoming bombs. The front was not a line so much as a bleeding wound widening day by day. In that atmosphere, the Soviet state did something no other major combatant did on the same scale. It created entire frontline combat aviation regiments composed of women. Women served in aviation roles in many countries during the Second World War, but the Soviet Union went further than anyone else. This was not about a few exceptional individuals quietly attached to a unit. This was the formation of fully female combat regiments, pilots, navigators, mechanics, armorers tasked with flying and fighting. More than 500,000 Soviet women took part in the war effort in various capacities, and hundreds served in military aviation as pilots, navigators, gunners, radio operators, and technicians. The numbers matter because they show it wasn't an anomaly. It was an entire slice of the Red Army's war machine that ran on the labor and courage of women who were asked to do what many men, including experienced commanders, thought they could not. But this was not inevitable. It did not happen simply because the Soviet Union was progressive, a myth that collapses the second you examine how deeply patriarchal assumptions ran through both Soviet society and the military. It happened because one person knew how to apply pressure at exactly the right moment, and because in late 1941 the Soviet leadership was desperate enough to listen. Her name was Marina Raskova. Before the war, Raskova was already a celebrity, the kind of public figure the Soviet Union cultivated with care. She was a record-setting aviator, one of the most famous women pilots in the country, and her fame wasn't accidental. In the 1930s, Soviet propaganda loved the image of the daring Soviet woman proving socialism's promise in steel and altitude, and aviation was the purest stage for that performance. Clean, modern, heroic. Raskova's reputation was built on real achievement, but it was also amplified by a state that understood the power of symbols. When Germany invaded, thousands of women wrote letters asking to be sent to the front. Many were refused, told to serve in factories or hospitals, told that combat was not their place. Raskova did something different. She used her personal authority and connections to push the idea of women's combat aviation from the realm of aspiration into policy. And in October 1941, with the German advance still threatening the heart of the Soviet state, Soviet leadership approved the creation of 3 all-female aviation units, 3 regiments, 3 very different missions, 3 very different aircraft, and 3 very different kinds of fear. One was a fighter regiment equipped with Yakovlev Yak-1 fighters, fast, sharp, demanding machines designed for aerial combat. Another was a bomber regiment that began with the Sukhoi Su-2, and later transitioned to the Petlikov P-2, one of the most technically challenging aircraft in the Soviet arsenal, a twin-engine dive bomber that required precision and nerve. The third was a night bomber regiment flying the Polikarpov Po-2, an outdated biplane wood and fabric, slow, vulnerable an aircraft that seemed like a cruel joke compared to the sleek machines of modern air war. And yet, that last regiment would become the most famous. The training and organization happened quickly, because it had to. The women were gathered and selected personally under Ruskova's oversight, then pushed through accelerated military preparation. They trained at Engels near Saratov, a place that would become their world. Barracks, hangars, classrooms, icy runways, the smell of fuel and damp wool, the constant pressure of a timetable that assumed every day saved in training might be paid back by a life saved or taken at the front. Many of these women were young, some had flown before, in civilian clubs and organizations like Oso Aviakim, where Soviet citizens learned basic aviation and military skills. But training for war is not simply training to fly. It's training to fly while someone is trying to kill you. There is a particular tension in those months that later memoirs describe again and again, the combination of pride and dread. Pride because they knew the mission was historic, and because they were aware, in a very Soviet way, that they were embodying something the state wanted to show the world. Dread because they also knew what was happening at the front. Even in censored wartime conditions, people understood that units were being annihilated, that pilots were not coming back, that crash landings were not rare accidents, but routine punctuation. And then there was skepticism. It wasn't a German disbelief, it was Soviet disbelief too. Many male officers initially viewed the women's regiments as a propaganda experiment or an indulgence. There were arguments about whether women could handle the physical demands of combat flying, whether they could manage the stress, whether they could endure the cold at altitude, whether they had the aggression required for fighter combat, whether they could master complex navigation and instrument work. Some of these doubts were expressed in patronizing language. Others were expressed in a colder, bureaucratic way, concerns about combat readiness, discipline, reliability. The women understood they were being watched, not only by the enemy, but by their own side. That pressure became fuel. In war, competence can be a form of defiance. The first flights, the first inspections, the first times they walked out to aircraft while male personnel stared every routine act became a test. The fighter unit, eventually known as the 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment, flew the Yak-1 and primarily served in air defense roles, protecting key targets from German bombers. Air defense might sound less glamorous than dogfights over the front, but it carried its own terror. Intercepts happened fast. The warning might come late. The weather could be treacherous. And the stakes were strategic. Factories, rail hubs, bridges, cities fail, and people die in their beds. The bomber regiment, the one that would become famous for flying the P-2, faced a different burden. The P-2 was not a forgiving aircraft. It was fast and capable, but it demanded training and coordination. Dive bombing required discipline and nerves, a steep plunge toward the earth, the ground rushing up, anti-aircraft fire reaching like claws, the moment of bomb release, then the pullout that could crush the body with G-forces and punish any error with impact. Mastering that aircraft was the kind of challenge that male pilots sometimes struggled with, even in peacetime training. For a new regiment, under wartime acceleration, the margin for error was thin. And then there was the Night Bomber Regiment, the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, later redesignated the 46th Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, the unit most people now associate with that Night Witch's nickname. Their PO-2 biplanes were simple, cheap, and outdated. The Po-2 was used for training and crop dusting. It was not designed to fight modern war. It had limited speed and altitude. It offered no armor. It carried a small bomb load compared to heavier bombers. In daylight, against fighters, it would be slaughtered, so they flew at night, low and slow. Their tactics became a strange blend of improvisation and professionalism. They would approach the target area, sometimes in groups, sometimes staggered. Near the objective, they would cut the engine and glide. The sudden silence was part of the weapon. Without engine noise, a POW-2 could seem like a phantom. The aircraft would slip through darkness, drop bombs, then restart the engine and vanish into the night before German gunners could adjust. The planes were vulnerable to searchlights and flak, and the open cockpit meant the crew was directly exposed to freezing air, sometimes with frost forming on goggles, fingers stiffening on controls. This is where the story often becomes romanticized women in fragile planes, humiliating the enemy with cunning. But to stay honest, you have to emphasize what fragile meant in physical terms. A PO2 was wood and fabric. It could be torn apart by machine gun fire. It could be torn apart by machine gun fire. It could burn. It could be knocked down by a near miss. Its cockpit was open to the night. Its navigation equipment was limited. Weather was not just an inconvenience. It was a predator. And still these crews flew again and again, not once, not for a photo, for years. The war did not wait for them to become comfortable. The Soviet Union in 1942 was fighting for survival on multiple fronts, with the German advance pushing toward the Volga and the Caucasus. The names that would later become thunderous Stalingrad, Kursk, were, at the time, bleeding places where the future was being decided by exhaustion and steel. At Stalingrad, the Soviet Air Force fought under relentless conditions. The city became a shattered landscape where rubble and smoke changed wind patterns and made flying more dangerous. The air over the region was crowded with machines, and the ground below was a killing field of artillery and anti-aircraft guns. It was here, in the broader battle space around Stalingrad, that some of the most famous female fighter pilots entered legend and tragedy. The Women's Fighter Regiment itself primarily served in air defense, but several pilots transferred to frontline units. That's an important detail because it shows both the flexibility and the contradictions of Soviet wartime organization. The all-female regiments were a unique experiment, but the Soviet system was also relentlessly utilitarian. Talent would be moved to where it was needed. In the chaos of war, individuals could be reassigned, units reorganized, designations changed. The story of Soviet women in the air is not a single neat narrative. It's a thread running through a constantly shifting tapestry of crisis and counteroffensive. Among those who became famous were pilots like Lydia Litvinyak and Yekaterina Budanova, both of whom flew Yak fighters and became known as highly skilled aviators under pressure. Litvinyak, often remembered by the nickname White Rose of Stalingrad, was credited as a fighter ace, one of the most celebrated female fighter pilots in history. Budanova, too, earned a reputation for aggressive and effective combat flying. Their careers unfolded in a world where a pilot could be alive in the morning and dead by afternoon, where victories were counted in seconds and mistakes were permanent. What did it mean to be a fighter pilot on the Eastern Front? Imagine the physical sensation first, the vibration of the engine through the airframe, the smell of oil and exhaust, the tightness of straps, the claustrophobic cockpit, the horizon tilting violently as you bank. Then the psychological environment, constant alertness, the awareness that your opponent might see you before you see them, that a single burst of cannon fire could tear through metal and flesh, that the sky so often described as freedom had become an arena where death could come from any direction. These women fought not in spite of being watched, but while being watched. Every victory could be used as propaganda. Every loss could be used as proof that the experiment was flawed. That pressure does not show up in gun camera footage, but it lives in the texture of their story. And all the while, Marina Raskova, the architect of the program, remained a central figure until she didn't. War has a way of cutting down the people who seem too important to be lost. Raskova, who had helped create and organize these regiments, died in January 1943 in an aviation accident. The details of such incidents vary in retellings, but the fact is recorded. She did not live to see the end of the war and the full flowering of the legacy she began. Her death became part of the narrative, the famous aviator who not only advocated for women in combat aviation, but paid the same price that thousands of aircrew paid: sudden death in a machine that did not forgive. By the time the Soviet Union began turning the tide decisively, the women's regiments had moved from novelty to necessity. They had flown enough missions, suffered enough losses, and achieved enough results that it became harder to dismiss them as a political stunt. The skepticism did not vanish overnight. Institutions rarely change that cleanly, but performance has a brutal clarity in wartime. Bombs either hit or they don't. Targets are either destroyed or they aren't. Pilots either hit or they don't. The Night Bomber Regiment, operating at low altitude in darkness, became especially well known. Their missions were not the kind that created dramatic daylight footage. They were repetitive, exhausting, and psychologically grinding. Night after night, crews would take off, find the front by the glow of fires or the faint geometry of roads, creep toward target areas, and drop small bomb loads that nonetheless accumulated into real dash range. Their goal was often harassment, interdiction, and pressure, keeping enemy troops awake, disrupting supply lines, striking positions that were difficult to hit in other ways. In war, sleep can be as strategic as ammunition. A unit that cannot rest becomes slow, sloppy, and brittle. German troops noticed. They hated these raids not because each bomb destroyed an entire division, but because the raids were persistent and humiliating. The Po-2 was too slow for some fighters to engage easily at night without risk. Its low speed and low altitude made interception complicated, and its small profile made it a difficult target. Anti-aircraft fire was still deadly, but the Po-2's very crudeness sometimes worked in its favor. Modern warfare is full of such ironies. The most advanced machine is not always the most effective in a given niche, and sometimes the obsolete aircraft becomes lethal because it does not behave like the enemy expects. Then there was the bomber regiment that transitioned to the P-2, a centerpiece of Soviet tactical bombing. This regiment would participate in some of the most important offensives of the war, operations connected to Stalingrad, Kursk, Belarus, and East Prussia. Those are not just geographic labels. They represent phases in the Soviet war where the Red Army moved from desperate defense to massive, grinding, industrial-scale attack. Consider what it meant to fly a P-2 during these offensives. The aircraft carried more weight and moved faster than the PO-2, and it operated in a more intense envelope of enemy defenses. Dive bombing required the aircraft to expose itself during the attack run, making it vulnerable to flak. Navigation had to be accurate over shifting front lines. Coordination with ground forces mattered. Targets could include bridges, rail yards, troop concentrations, artillery positions, and other nodes that made the German war machine function. In a war defined by logistics, by fuel, ammunition, rail lines, and the movement of reserves, bombing could have consequences far beyond the immediate blast crater. The P-2's reputation as a demanding aircraft made the women's success with it especially significant. It was one thing, critics might say, for women to fly simple aircraft. It was another to master a twin-engine dive bomber under combat conditions. And they did. Not as a one-off story, but as a sustained operational reality. The Soviet Union's war effort did not have the luxury of letting sentiment override performance. The very fact that these crews kept flying speaks to a competence that overcame the initial doubts. By 1943, the Eastern Front was transformed. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 marked one of the great turning points, a colossal clash that involved enormous armored forces and intense air operations. The Soviet Union had learned painfully how to build layered defenses and how to absorb and then break German offensives. Air power was a critical part of this, both in supporting ground forces and in contesting the airspace above them. In this environment, the women's aviation units were not operating in a sideshow. They were part of the machinery of victory. But it's important to understand the cost. Soviet aircrew losses in the Second World War were severe across the board. flying combat missions was statistically dangerous in a way that is hard to convey to a modern audience accustomed to precision munitions and long-range standoff weapons. Every takeoff carried risk. Every landing carried risk. Weather killed, mechanical failures killed, training accidents killed, enemy fighters and killed, enemy fighters. For the night bomber crews, fatigue was itself a weapon used against them. Night operations invert the body's rhythms. They require concentration when the human system wants to shut down. Imagine trying to navigate by landmarks half hidden in darkness, under stress while your aircraft shakes and rattles, and the front below is a shifting pattern of muzzle flashes and fires. Imagine doing it not once, but repeatedly, with short sleep in between, sometimes grabbing rest in a cold tent or a rough barracks, waking up to do it again. For the fighter pilots, the stress was more acute and sudden. A scramble, a climb, the search for enemy aircraft, the shock of contact, the violence of maneuver, the brief and brutal exchange of fire, and then either the return to base or the silence of someone who doesn't come back. For the P-2 crews, the danger combined complexity and exposure. Twin engines meant more systems to fail, and while redundancy could save lives, it also added maintenance demands. Dive bombing meant pushing the aircraft into a steep descent that tested airframe and crew. Anti-aircraft fire did not care about legend or gender or morale. It was mathematics and shrapnel. And yet, across these units, the women kept flying and accumulating what modern militaries would call operational tempo. By the end of the war, the women of these regiments had flown thousands of missions. That number is not simply a statistic to be admired. It represents thousands of times when someone climbed into a cockpit knowing the odds and went anyway. Thousands of times when mechanics, also women in these regiments, worked in harsh conditions to keep aircraft serviceable. Thousands of times when a navigator unfolded maps under dim light, tracing routes with gloved fingers, aware that a small error could send an aircraft into the wrong valley, into the wrong concentration of guns, into the wrong patch of sky. There were decorations and honors, too, which became part of how the Soviet system recognized and publicized achievement. Units gained guard status, a mark of distinction in the Soviet military. Individual pilots and navigators earned awards for bravery and performance. Names became symbols. But it is worth pausing on an uncomfortable truth. Awards do not capture what the service actually demanded day by day. They capture moments, not the grinding accumulation of fear and exhaustion. As Soviet forces pushed westward, the geography of the war changed, but the essence of these missions did not. In 1944, the Red Army launched massive offensives, including the campaign in Belarus known as Operation Bagration, which began in June 1944, and devastated German Army Group Center. This was war at a scale that turned forests into graveyards and roads into rivers of mud and fuel. Air operations supported breakthroughs, struck retreating columns, disrupted reinforcements. Bombers and night harassment aircraft played their roles in a larger system designed to unbalance and then destroy. Then came the push into East Prussia and toward Germany itself, where the fighting became even more bitter. East Prussia was heavily defended, and the collapse of the Eastern Front brought with it not only military desperation but civilian catastrophe. By 1945, Soviet air operations were part of a final drive that aimed to end the war by crushing the German state's ability to fight. The Women's Bomber Regiment participated in operations around East Prussia, flying missions into some of the most dangerous late-war air defense environments. The German military, though battered, was still capable of inflicting lethal losses. At this point in the story, it's tempting to treat the women's regiments as a self-contained heroic saga, a clean arc from skepticism to triumph. Real history is messier. These women were operating inside a Soviet system that could be brutally indifferent to individual suffering. The same state that celebrated their achievements also imposed political controls, censorship, and a culture where inconvenient truths could be buried. The same war that opened a door for women into combat aviation did not automatically guarantee long-term equality. Wartime necessity is a powerful but temporary force. It can expand roles dramatically and then try to compress them again when the crisis passes. And yet, something irreversible had happened in the air over the Eastern Front. The existence of these regiments proved, in the most unforgiving environment imaginable, that women could be trained, deployed, and sustained as combat aviation frontline operation, not as auxiliaries, not as mascots, as professionals doing lethal work that mattered not only for gender roles, but for the psychology of the Soviet war effort itself. The Great Patriotic War, as it was known in the USSR, became a foundational myth of Soviet identity after 1945, a story of collective sacrifice and victory. Women's participation in combat aviation complicated that myth in a way that could be both useful and uncomfortable. Useful because it demonstrated total mobilization and ideological strength. Uncomfortable because it raised questions about why such equality was possible in war, but often constrained in peace. For the individuals who survived, the aftermath was not a simple return to normal life. Many veterans carried physical and psychological scars. Some continued in aviation or the military. Others tried to build civilian lives in a country shattered by loss and reconstruction. The Soviet Union emerged from the war victorious but devastated, with tens of millions dead and entire regions destroyed. In that environment, personal stories could be swallowed by the enormity of national trauma. The legacy of the women's aviation regiments also traveled beyond Soviet borders. During the Cold War, the image of Soviet women who had fought in the sky became part of a broader ideological competition. The USSR presenting itself as a society that had mobilized all its citizens, that had proven women's capability not only in factories but in combat. Western audiences sometimes treated these stories with fascination, sometimes with skepticism, sometimes with romanticization. Meanwhile, in Eastern Bloc contexts shaped by Soviet influence, the narrative could serve as both inspiration and political messaging, but strip away the propaganda layers, both Soviet and anti-Soviet, and what remains is still extraordinary. In October 1941, when the Soviet leadership approved those 3 all-female aviation units, it was making a gamble in the middle of a catastrophe. The gamble was that accelerated training, guided by Marina Raskova's selection and oversight, could turn young women, many with civilian flight backgrounds, into combat crews fast enough to matter. The gamble was that these units would perform under fire. The gamble was that these units would pip apart. The gamble was that the social friction, the skepticism, the logistical challenges of uniforms, equipment, and integration into a male-dominated military system could be managed. What actually happened was more intense than what anyone could have predicted. These women did not merely participate. They were integrated into the brutal arithmetic of the Eastern Front. They flew fighters in defense and combat roles. They flew the technically demanding P-2 dive bomber in major offensives from the struggle around Stalingrad through Kursk and later operations in Belarus and East Prussia. They flew night harassment missions in Po-2 biplanes, the kind of aircraft that looked like it belonged to another decade, and turned that weakness into a tactic gliding in under darkness, close to the ground, dropping bombs with a precision born from repetition and nerves. And in doing so, they created a chapter in military aviation history that remains unusual even now. Many nations have had female aviators. Many have had women in uniform, but entire combat aviation regiments composed of women, deployed into sustained frontline operations during a total war between industrial states that is rare enough to feel almost implausible until you remember what kind of war this was and what kind of country the Soviet Union was forced to become to survive it. There is one more irony that lingers over the story. The Po-2's whispering glide, the sound that haunted German troops, was produced by an aircraft that, on paper, should have been obsolete. The Po-2, the complex dive bomber, demanded skills that skeptics insisted women couldn't master. The Yak-1 fighters required the same aggressive instincts and quick judgment as any other fighter. In each case, the assumptions failed in contact with reality. The war did not care about stereotypes, it cared about results. Today, when we think about combat aviation, we tend to picture sealed cockpits, digital avionics, radar-guided missiles, and engagements that happen beyond visual range. It is easy from that distance to reduce the Second World War to iconic images, contrails, dogfights, victory markings on fuselages. But the story of Soviet women fighting the Germans in bombers pulls you back down into the human scale of the thing. It reminds you that air power is not just technology. It is bodies enduring cold, fear, vibration, and fatigue. It is hands-on throttles and controls, eyes scanning dark skies, minds calculating routes and risks. It is mechanics tightening bolts in miserable weather, because an engine failure on takeoff is not a statistic. It is a dead crew and a wrecked aircraft and another gap in the lineup tomorrow night. And it raises a question that still matters. When societies face existential threat, what hidden capabilities do they suddenly discover in the people they have underestimated? The Soviet Union's women aviators were not a miracle. They were the product of training, discipline, and an opportunity created by crisis and opportunity that came at a terrible price. Their story is gripping not because it is a fairy tale of empowerment, but because it is a wartime thriller written in real names, real dates, and real wreckage, where the sky was both battlefield and graveyard. The German soldiers who cursed the night witches were reacting to a tactical problem, an enemy that would not let them sleep. The Soviet commanders who initially doubted women's combat readiness were reacting to an ingrained assumption about who belonged in a cockpit, and the women themselves were reacting to something more personal and more dangerous, a war that had come to their country with extermination on its mind, a war where survival demanded that everyone who could fight did. In the end, the most shocking fact is not that they flew, it's that they kept flying through skepticism, through loss, through weather, through flak, through the constant knowledge that a wooden biplane or a dive bomber or a fighter could become a coffin in seconds. Their legacy lives not just in medals or unit histories, but in the broader truth they proved under the worst conditions imaginable. Competence has no gender, and courage in the dark over a burning front sounds less like a speech and more like the thin, fading hush of an engine cut to silence, as a fragile aircraft glides toward a target, carrying two people who know exactly what the night can do to them, and go anyway.